okay, medicines can actually have a big impact in these patients' lives. But then we also realized there were huge barriers to people actually getting these medications. Why?
Still existing barriers remain, and what can we all do together as a scientific community to really move things forward for patients with serious mental illness as well as substance use disorders?
When we began to understand the role that adherence would play in driving better outcomes in patients with schizophrenia, for example, we thought long-acting injectable antipsychotics would be niche products. They turned out to be big products. If you look up how many drugs are approved for narcolepsy, there's a bunch of different options. But if you ask patients about what their lived experience is with narcolepsy type 1 or narcolepsy type 2, there is a huge amount of unmet need for these patients. When you develop the drug, you can't just think about it in terms of some numerical measurement of wakefulness time during the day. It's probably essential for approval, but to give a patient a sense of what the experience will be to live and take this drug on a chronic basis, that's new information. And that's information that's worth developing in the context of a clinical development program.
Hi, everyone. Today I am joined by Richard Pops, who is the chairman and CEO of Alkermes, a leading neuroscience pharmaceutical company that specializes in treating addiction and serious mental illness. Rich has been CEO of Alkermes since 1991, and under his leadership, the company has grown quite substantially from a privately held firm with 25 employees to a publicly traded company with over 2,000 employees. Rich, I'm really excited to have you here with us today.
So I was beginning to say, Chase, this sensibility derives from this presence we've had in these therapeutic areas that we didn't get into intentionally. We got into because the science took us in that direction. When we began to understand the role that adherence would play in driving better outcomes in patients with schizophrenia, for example, our early work with J&J, we thought long-acting injectable antipsychotics would be niche products. They turned out to be big products because part of the disease is the inability or the unwillingness to take your medication every day. And if you don't take your medication, then you can't derive the benefits from it. So we began to understand that okay, medicines can actually have a big impact in these patients' lives. But then we also realized there were huge barriers to people actually getting these medications. Why? Because the system, and we can talk more specifically about what the system is, but the system writ large had all kinds of barriers to make sure patients didn't get access to medicines because the system believes that there's plenty of medications and people can do just fine. And so this mismatch between what even certain caregivers, providers, and treatment systems believe is acceptable standard of care and what patients report themselves in their lives, the space between there in serious mental illness and addiction and in other CNS indications can be very, very broad, very vast. So I'll give an example where right now, if you launch a new drug for schizophrenia, payers will say you need to fail on multiple generic drugs before you can get access to a branded medication. Implicit in that is this idea that the branded medications aren't any better than the generics. Use the generics. And it just analogizes to a cancer setting where you'd say, well, you have to fail on multiple cancer drugs before you get access to this newer drug. It just doesn't make any sense, yet it persists in the serious mental illness and addiction space like crazy. So that sensibility, around here, we got very interested in the idea of how to break down those barriers through medical information, through clinical trials, through policy, through all kinds of ways to try to make sure that the benefits of this innovation can make its way to the patient. So you say, well, stigmatized conditions like serious mental illness and addiction, they're special. Well, then we start working in narcolepsy. And it's striking because you realize that many people believe, oh, there are plenty of medications for narcolepsy. There's treatment options. If you look up how many drugs are approved for narcolepsy, there's a bunch of different options. But if you ask patients about what their lived experience is with narcolepsy type 1 or narcolepsy type 2, there is a huge amount of unmet need for these patients. Because they may have more wakefulness during the day due to certain drugs, but they talk about brain fog. They talk about on Maslow's hierarchical of needs. They're not focused on things other than just getting by every day and surviving and having enough energy to do what they need to do, rather than thriving and really flourishing in their life experience. That's really interesting. So that tells you when you develop the drug, you can't just think about it in terms of some numerical measurement of wakefulness time during the day. That's interesting. It's important. It's probably essential for approval. But to give a patient a sense of what the experience will be to live and take this drug on a chronic basis, that's new information. And that's information that's worth developing in the context of a clinical trial development program. And also, it's a way that you have to go into the marketplace, understand you're going to fight for patients' ability to get access to important new drugs. Because right now there's a belief that drugs are expensive and in an unwarranted way. And while that can be true in certain instances, we know in many cases it's not true. And these drugs can have a profound impact, not just on the measurement that leads to the FDA approval, but the overall quality of patients' lives. And that sentiment, that energy is really intrinsic to, I think, what we've built here at this company.
No, that's incredible. I want to go deeper on the point you mentioned around narcolepsy. Obviously, from our previous conversations, we've discussed how a lot of the products you're developing are not just meant to modify symptoms, but modify the disease itself. How do you think about that pertaining to a lot of those patients that that have narcolepsy and don't yet have a viable product addressing things like their brain fog and many of the other symptoms that they're continuing to manifest, given existing treatment options today are not really modifying the disease itself. What can you share there so far?
I think that the great promise of these orexin 2 receptor agonists is the fact that they are likely disease modifying, as you say. So if I were on the whiteboard, I'd draw a series of concentric shelves. The core is narcolepsy type 1, which is a deficiency of orexin. So it's sort of the canonical example of the pharmacology. If you replace the missing neurotransmitter, do you drive more normal wakefulness? That is inherently disease modifying, because the disease is an absence of that neurotransmitter. The problem is you can't just replace the neurotransmitter itself, because it's not a drug. It doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. It's a peptide. It's not going to be. So the challenge was, could you make a small molecule analog of a large molecule that also could be taken orally once a day and cross the blood-brain barrier? That's a series of design challenges that make it dauntingly difficult to make one of these. But if you can do that, it should have a profound impact on the modification of a profound impact on the disease itself. Now, what's interesting about the brain fog and all these other aspects of it is that it just represents the fact that the current medications are addressing certain aspects of the symptoms and putting patches on there, but not getting to the underlying disease itself. Now, on that series of concentric shells, narcolepsy being right in the center, now, if you're actually effectively targeting the circuitry in the brain that drives wakefulness, you demonstrate that in first principles by replacing it when it's missing in a disease. But what does it do to the intact brain if you give super therapeutic concentrations of these peptide analogs that drive wakefulness? Can that be effective in other disease indications? Well, we have our first indication of that with idiopathic hypersomnia, which is not a lack of orexin, but we showed significant increases in wakefulness in patients with idiopathic hypersomnia. What about other conditions where patients' lives are seriously affected by their excessive daytime sleepiness? MS has serious MS fatigue. Alzheimer's patients can vary. Other neurodegenerative processes, people have serious, part of the disease is that they just feel tired all day. What if you can address that with one of these? So this is actually, on one end of the spectrum, is totally disease modifying in the narcolepsy type 1 example. But on the other side, it may just be symptomatic relief of something that's really critically affecting someone's day-to-day life with a chronic condition. That's what's so interesting about this program across that full spectrum.
Have you guys ever thought about other disease categories as well? Anything in the rheumatologic category? A lot of those patients obviously experiencing brain fog, fatigue, or is that something that you're holding off on and maintaining your focus right now on just neurologic disorders?
Starting with the CNS side of it, yes. But the more we get into it, the more these adjacencies start to reveal themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's lots of patients who are still complaining of long COVID effects on brain fog.
Absolutely.
A lot of those CNS effects from various different viruses, not just autoimmune, not just autoimmune disorders, but many different subsets of disorders that are affecting CNS. And it's really incredible. It's really incredible the fact that you've been focusing specifically on these subset of diseases and disorders for such a long time, Rich, and the fact that you're dedicating your time, your focus to treating patients with these diseases is really incredible. I want to go back to the system piece that you mentioned earlier, because the system, what can you share around how the system is making it easier for patients, and where some of the existing, where some of those, let's just call it, still existing barriers remain, and what can we all do together as a scientific community to really move things forward for patients with serious mental illness and as well as substance use disorders. What can we do there?
You ever heard that old phrase, the soft bigotry of low expectations? And it's really a thoughtful comment as it relates to people with addiction, for example. There's not an expectation that people can resume normal lives. It's like, well, let's minimize the harm that they're facing. Let's give them an opioid, and they'll maintain a physical dependence on opioid for the rest of their life. And maybe for certain patients that is life-saving for them. That's important. But for the expectation to be that someone with schizophrenia, or someone with addiction, or somebody with bipolar disease, or somebody with narcolepsy can't ultimately get to, like, what's the asymptote that you should be able to approach? You should, in my mind, that asymptote should always be normal, right? Having not a degraded experience, but a normal experience. That should be what we aspire to. So systematically, one of the things that we've been doing in the industry, and this also relates to the work I do on PDUFA with FDA, was elevating the patient voice in the drug development and review process. What falls under the mantra or under the rubric of patient-focused drug development. So, for example, if you want to get a drug approved for schizophrenia, you use the positive and negative symptom scale, PANSS. That's how you get it approved. It's a scale. You move it X number of points. You separate from placebo with an alpha less than 0.5. You can file for approval. It tells you very little about the patient's experience taking the medication. If you want to get a drug for narcolepsy approved, narcolepsy type 1, if you improve the maintenance of wakefulness test, you keep them awake longer. But in so doing, we're also asking people all kinds of what are called patient-reported outcomes, PROs. But those are not approvable right now. What we've been fighting to do is get that information. We're not even looking to be able to approve drugs on it, but just be able to get that information into the label, just so it's information. And it's fraught. You understand scientifically, it's fraught with risk, right? You can rig the game so that things look better than, and that's not the point. The point is, in a rigorous way, in a qualified way, let's use assays that begin to capture what it means to take a drug, not just once, but maybe chronically, and incorporate that information so patients can make a decision about how they want to treat their disease. So I think that's an important part of it, is just elevating that science to capture the patient experience, so it's not viewed as just anecdotal and therefore worthless, but then elevating to the point where it can be communicated by pharmaceutical companies and physicians and trusted by regulators.
Oh, that's great. And when you think about, I like how you describe, how can we as a system really start to pay more attention to the patient, really focusing on the patient. How do you think about that from the perspective of of when you're commercializing a product? How does that, not just within drug development, within clinical trials, but How do you think about that also within the commercialization product of new products?
It's fascinating. This is something that I never would have anticipated when we started the company and thought, you had this naive belief that if you build a great medicine, the world will beat a path to your door. And in some cases, that's true in certain disease areas, but not in the ones that we've chosen to work in. So the commercial footprint is so extensive, necessary to bring a medicine for serious mental illness, for example, schizophrenia, bipolar disease, because relatively there's less drug development happening in this area, because you realize even if you're successful on the drug development side, you've got a huge commercial challenge ahead of you. Versus, develop a very high priced orphan rare disease pediatric drug, you can charge hundreds of thousands of dollars for it. People will pay for it, and they're clamoring to get it. So it's a very different commercial construct to be able to bring these medicines to patients. But it's critical that companies like ours do it. Otherwise, we're not going to break down these impediments.